Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dare to Lead from the Middle, Make an Impact, presented by Jeff Abbott. Jeff is senior faculty member at the Security and Exchange Commission's College of Leadership Development and a 30-year Coast Guard veteran, leading the Coast Guard Performance Excellence Program and Commandant's Innovation Council and commanding the R&D Center. Jeff supported DHS as a Homeland Security Institute Fellow and is an Excellence in Government Senior Fellow, former co-coach, and Leadership Alumni Board member. His passion is leading change from the middle. Jeff holds a doctorate in business administration, 2 MIT graduate degrees, and a Coast Guard Academy bachelor's degree. He served as a national director of the Society of American Military Engineers and as a founding board of director of MIT's Military Alumni Association. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Abbott.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Glad to see everyone here this morning. And Cheryl, thank you for that kind introduction, greatly appreciated. As mentioned, I spent 30 years my federal career as a Coast Guard officer, held a variety of great jobs, including several involving people who had really good ideas and tried to implement them. And many were successful and some weren't. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Some of the jobs I had, some of the best jobs I had the opportunity to chair the Commandant's Innovation Council. My job was to encourage people to be proactive, to take initiative, to improve their part of the organization. I had commanded the Coast Guard's Research and Development Center when the 9/11 terrorist attacks happened. And we had to really shift missions on a dime and go from oil spills and counter-narcotics operations into maritime security and counterterrorism. I've had the pleasure and honor of being an Excellence in Government Senior Fellow. And I currently teach leadership for a federal agency where I've been for the past 9 years. And as Cheryl mentioned, I'm passionate about encouraging people at all levels to be proactive and challenge the status quo by overcoming challenges, improving processes, seizing opportunities, and improving performance. So I'm going to tell you a few stories that I hope you find not only interesting, but inspirational, with concepts and strategies that you can apply in your own professional and personal lives in order to make your piece of the world just a little bit better by leading from wherever you are in your organization. You don't have to be formally supervising people. You don't have to be the CEO. And hopefully this will end up in improving, providing you some tips and some guidance for leading at different levels in professional meetings, but also even in sharing stories with your kids. The primary theme today is about motivating people to lead, regardless of their position, initiate or influence positive change that results in meaningful impacts. So let's get started. In August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina came ashore in southern Mississippi and Louisiana. And the levees around New Orleans broke, were exceeded, and flooded tens of square miles of the city, the French Quarter and other areas in New Orleans. I'm going to tell you two stories that really touched my heart. One, I deployed down there a few days after Katrina took place, and you couldn't fly into New Orleans because all the airports were closed. So we flew into into Mobile, Alabama, where the Coast Guard had an air station, and they were sending helicopters back and forth to New Orleans to rescue people. And while I was waiting for a Coast Guard helicopter, I was talking with the commanding officer, Captain Dave Callahan. He later became an admiral. And I asked Dave, what was it like flying into New Orleans those first couple of days? And he said, Jeff, it was surreal. He said, it was like flying into a sea of fireflies. And I said, Dave, I'm sorry, but I don't understand. What do you mean? He said, well, after a couple of days, the emergency generators ran out of fuel. There were no lights on in the city. All the streets were flooded. There were no headlights. There were no billboards. The hotels weren't lit up. Even the aircraft warning lights were out. But as our helicopters were approaching at nighttime, they saw like all these flickering lights, and it's like a sea of fireflies. And as we got closer, we realized what it was there's people on their balconies, on their garages, on their rooftops, waving flashlights, waiting to be rescued by the Coast Guard and others. And all in all, the Coast Guard rescued over 33,500 people from this situation over several days. But he said, Jeff, I got to tell you this one story one of my pilots told me. He said they were rescuing people in the residential community. They just dropped off their rescue swimmer on the top of one of these houses, residential houses. And he said, hey, Charlie, we have to go ahead and refuel. I'll be back in about 30 minutes. Just hang tight. Helicopter left. And when the helicopter left and came back half an hour later, Charlie, the rescue swimmer, was just a sea of emotions. He was frustrated. He was distraught. He was angry. He was grieving. And the pilot said, Charlie, what happened? We were only gone half an hour. And he said, sir, when you left and the noise from the helicopter died away, I could hear yelling and banging on the roof underneath that I was standing on. And it was a family trapped in their attic. And the water was already above the second story windows and still rising. I had no way to get to them. I tried pulling shingles off with my bare hands. I got a few off, but then there was plywood sheathing. I tried kicking through the plywood with my boots, but I couldn't get through. And I'm really, I'm afraid that family drowned or is going to drown because I didn't have the right tools to do the job. And, damn it, sir, I joined the Coast Guard to be a rescue swimmer to save every single life I could, not to lose a single one. And this is just not right. Later that night, the helicopters returned around midnight to Mobile. Charlie and two of his friends went to the local hardware store and they bought every fire axe they had in the place. And the next morning, they made sure with their leadership that every Coast Guard helicopter coming out of Mobile was equipped with a fire axe. So if they encountered a similar situation, they could chop through the roof and rescue the people that were at risk. 2 weeks later, I had deployed now to Hurricane Rita in Texas, and Hurricane Rita came ashore between New Orleans and Texas just within 2 weeks of Hurricane Katrina. But I was back in Washington and I was attending a congressional hearing. And I ran into a good friend of mine, I'll call him Rich, and Rich was a senior DHS civilian that I met in New Orleans. And he comes over, gives me a big handshake and says, Jeff, thank goodness for the Coast Guard. And I kind of smiled and said, so is it, you talking about the rescue swimmers, Rich, or are we talking about the small boat drivers or the helicopter pilots? He said, no, the procurement specialist. I said, really? I said, I've not heard this story. You have to tell me. And Rich had been assigned to kind of observe what was going on at a FEMA logistics center. And this is where they were receiving all the procurement requests from first responders that the federal government was going to support and pay for many of these items. And Rich had an interesting observation. He noticed that, and most of the procurement specialists were FEMA employees, but they're assisted by some people from other agencies. So there was a storekeeper from the Coast Guard who was helping out. And Rich noticed that the FEMA procurement specialists, their inboxes had about 4 to 6 inches worth of requests, and they were processing them as quickly as they could. But the Coastie, the storekeeper, only had about half an inch of procurement requests in his spot. And Rich went over to the supervisor. He said, I've been watching your operation here, and I don't understand. Why don't you give the Coastie as much work as you do the FEMA procurement specialists? I mean, he seems competent. And he said, oh, I do. He's just processing them faster. And Rich thought, well, that's interesting. And he went and talked with one of the FEMA procurement specialists, and he said, so please tell me how you process your paperwork. He said, well, I've got a limit of $2,500 on my government credit card. If it's above that, I send it up to my boss. If it's below that, I take a look at what FEMA is authorized to purchase. And we have a list of all those things we can purchase. And if it's on that list, then I go ahead and approve it. If it's not on that list, I either reject it or I set it aside for our very busy senior managers to review. He said, Rich says, okay, that seems reasonable. Then he goes and he talks to the Coastie, tell me how you process your work. And the Coastie said, well, I've got a credit card of $2,500. Above that, I send it to my boss. But if it's below that, what I do is I take a look at those things that FEMA is not authorized to buy. And if it's something that we're prohibited from buying, I don't buy it. But unless it's on that list, um, I'm going to give the benefit of a doubt to first responders because we are encountering a situation we've never seen before, and people getting really creative on how to save lives and protect property. And I'm not going to second guess them unless it's something that looks obviously fraudulent. I'm going to give them the benefit of a doubt, and you can see the difference in mindset there. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and I've got a question for you I'd like to ask. So based on those two stories, what did those two petty officers do differently than their peers or differently than the standard operating procedures that were in place? And please go ahead and respond in chat. I'll give you about 15 seconds and then we'll move on. So just take a moment, respond in chat, and I will respond live during our session. It was quite an exciting time down in New Orleans and in Texas during those hurricanes. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what I mean by leading from the middle. Leading from the middle is initiating or influencing action when you don't have really all the complete direct control of all the resources or policies or staff that you need to achieve a desired outcome. Um, and while we don't control all those assets or all those factors to make change, we certainly can influence others who can contribute to our efforts. And that includes our bosses, our senior leadership, our peers, officials in other agencies, other organizations we might be partnering with, our customers or suppliers, and professionals in the same organizations, including TOC, our TOC colleagues. But what leading from the middle is not, it's not waiting to be told what to do. It assumes people know the mission, they know what needs to be done, they know what the endpoint is. Some things are time critical. Sometimes you might not have time to run it all the way through channels, but if you know what the mission is and you're doing it with good intent, that's really what leading from the middle is, and how do you move forward. And the Katrina stories we just talked about are examples of people in the middle of the organization. These were first-class petty officers. They were not admirals or captains in the Coast Guard. They were not even officers, but they knew what needed to be done and they took action. They didn't wait to be told what to do. That's going to lead us to another question. So I want you to think about, in our jobs or careers, there's times when you either led from the middle, and that means leading beyond your quote unquote formal authority, or you had good ideas or initiatives and were stymied or unable to implement them. What challenges did you face and what obstacles got in your way? So if you could put that in the chat box and I will respond to those. Again, what challenges did you face and what obstacles got in your way? And I'll give you about 10 seconds here. Okay, we're going to move ahead to the next slide. So you might wonder if leading from the middle is a random process, or is it dependent on your unique situation, or is there a path that you can follow in most cases? And the good news, there are typically 8 steps, from selecting your challenge to actually implementing and proving your impact. So I'll just briefly describe these. I plan on providing a copy of the slides to everyone so you don't have to write all these down. But first, you need to decide what challenges to work on first. You may have several options, but how do you prioritize? And then identify, evaluate, and evolve your ideas and your solutions. Often that involves talking to people, maybe stakeholders, maybe people that are close to the process, and getting more ideas and refining your concept. Gaining the buy-in of stakeholders, and that includes people who benefit from your idea, but also those who might feel disenfranchised, or people who might think, if we do this, this will somehow hurt me or my part of the organization professionally. That's what I call challengers. And what you want to try to do, you want to get their story too, and you want to mitigate, and if possible, eliminate the sources of challenge, the concerns of challengers. Because if you can turn them around, they can become some of your best proponents. Taking reasonable risk and seeking opportunities, and address criteria that decision makers consider when they decide whether or not to support an initiative. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Then develop an implementation plan and consider the best or most effective strategies to use. And I'm going to propose some strategies that might be helpful. Then implement a pilot test or a prototype of your idea or solution. Test it out, see how it works. Learn from any failures or setbacks that you have, and then try again. When I had command of the R&D Center, what we learned to do is we wanted to fail quickly. But we wanted to learn each time. And it was an iterative process as we got closer and closer to a solution that would really be effective. And then finally, you want to measure and prove your progress and your impact. And the impact is really important to continue support for your project. Okay, so gaining support of decision makers. Like I said, I based my experience on hundreds of different innovation initiatives, R&D projects, and these themes, 6 themes kept coming up again and again, and were criteria where decision makers use to decide whether or not they're going to support an initiative or a new idea. And these include relevance. It has to be relevant to your agency and the agency's mission and value, and not just positive impact, but significant impact relative to the agency mission and a high potential return on any required resources. And then supportability. What this means is, will others support your initiative or resist it? And who specifically will support it, or who might resist it? And how much influence do they have with other decision makers in the group? And I often say that it's counterintuitive, but you'd think you have to get everybody to support your idea at first, and that's not really the case. What is important, though, is that nobody says no to it, because a highly influential decision maker who says, no, this isn't going to work, can kill your idea right away. Whereas people who are on the fence, they might want to see some more evidence. And if you do a pilot test, you may have a chance to prove that later on. Then they consider risk. And it's not just the actual risk, but it's perceived risk. And sometimes if you haven't done a very good job of building your business case or explaining what the pros and cons are, people might perceive that there's more risk than there really is. So it's really important to address that with your business case. Obviously, resource requirements and the cost are important. And if your idea requires a lot of resources, consider, where are those resources going to come from? Typically, it's in the middle of the fiscal year. Money has already been set aside for different projects. So it might be that money to support your project has to come from someone else's project. And that could actually turn them, potential supporters, into being challengers because they don't want to lose their project. And then finally, something I call downsides. And this is a little different than risk. An example of this is my son was working on his Eagle project. And what it was to put a nice looking decorative fence around the church trash container where the scouts have their meetings. And it was a good project, except for one thing. When Nick took it to the board of trustees at the church, they turned it down. And the reason they rejected it was not because of the project itself. They thought it was a good project, but because in order to do what Nick wanted to do, they'd have to use up 3 parking spaces. And parking was at a premium at the church. And they didn't think they could afford to do that because people were already parking on the street. So Nick was able to find another project, and that worked out fine. But he learned a little bit about how decision makers make decisions, the criteria they consider when making decisions. Okay, there are several tools that consultants use that can be helpful. Some of those you're probably aware of, others you might not be. SWOT analysis is fairly familiar, but essentially you take a look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of an organization or function or of a particular situation. And when you take a look at that, you play to your strengths and your opportunities. That gives you some options to consider. You want to make sure that you shore up any weaknesses or you're prepared for any threats. This SWOT analysis can generate a whole slew of different ideas, different innovative concepts you might want to, or initiatives you might want to consider. But how do you prioritize those? I mean, so maybe you've got 15 different ideas here. Then you can use something called an importance versus urgency matrix. This concept was actually developed and invoked by both President Eisenhower and also Stephen Covey, and famous leadership author. And essentially, you have a 2x2 matrix where you've got urgency on the y-axis, you've got importance on the x-axis. And what you want to do is you want to address first those issues that are urgent and important. So the top right quadrant here, work on those first. You don't want to waste any time, anything that's not urgent and not important, that bottom left quadrant. We often find organizations and teams working on things that are urgent, but are not that important. And that's not really the best use of our resources. For new initiatives, if you're trying to come up with a way to really help your organization, one area that is often really beneficial is working on things that are not urgent, but are important. Those items often get deferred. We don't have to do it this fiscal year or this quarter. So we push it off until next year, but it can make a big difference and have a big impact for the organization. So that's an area that I encourage you to consider when looking for projects. When you're trying to solve problems, there's something called root cause analysis. And that is really trying to get what is the root cause of the problem here. And there's something called the 5 whys. It's one process where you just keep asking why. Why did this happen? When I was a facilities engineer at a major Coast Guard base, we had heat go out in the commanding officer's quarters for the 3rd time in February. And obviously it was a hot topic. And we were on the captain was not real happy with us. But I asked, why did the heat go out? And well, we're not sure, sir. We think it was the boiler control. Okay. Why don't we know if it was the boiler control? Well, we really haven't had training in this because it's a historic structure and a historic system. Nobody makes this anymore. Okay. So where can we get the training? And, they found a place. I said, well, why haven't we gotten the training? And it's because when we compete against all the other training requirements, it doesn't compete. So I had to go back to my boss and tell them, this is going to happen again. I'm going to pay a couple $1,000s to get this thing fixed. It's going to happen again until we get the training. And through that, by getting to the root cause of the issue, we're actually able to increase our training budget by 3 times, threefold, and that's the following year, make sure we met those requirements. And then it's also something called problem anticipation, cause and effect diagrams. And that is anticipating all the possible potential failure modes and then addressing them up front so that you can avoid them. So you mitigate that possibility. Okay, so as chairman of the Innovation Council, I saw a lot, and R&D Center, I saw a lot of initiatives fail, and they seem to fall into certain buckets. So some of those buckets, some of the common reasons are, excuse me, and change initiatives don't achieve their expected results is mitigation strategy, or excuse me, sometimes you don't have enough staff or enough resources. One of the mitigation strategies you can use in this case is to consider resource sharing with others who might benefit from your idea. And they might be able to provide some staff or resources. Or you might be able to phase the project where you don't need all the resources on the front end. Another issue is sometimes it's not enough time, or the results take longer than you anticipate. And one of the options here, again, is you can phase a project, but you need to make sure that your first phase shows some productive results, some positive results that you can learn and improve upon, and you can use those to make a case for continued support. Sometimes you may have a lack of stakeholder engagement, and it's important to understand that your stakeholders, especially those that would benefit, really are committed to helping you achieve what you're assisting them with. And I would encourage you to really leverage that support and try to have 2 or 3 supporters that you can go to for each stakeholder group or each significant stakeholder group, because those are the people that can help you out. And if one major stakeholder gets transferred, then you still have people that still understand the project and what you're trying to do and who can still support you. Ineffective feedback systems. It's really important to get regular feedback on schedule, cost, and performance, so that if you need to, you can make adjustments early on. If you wait until it's too late, sometimes it's too hard to get back on track. And then finally, there's derailing events. Hurricane Katrina was one, pandemic that we're undergoing now, the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Those can shift priorities for the nation in a heartbeat. And at that point, you need to kind of reassess and say, okay, is my initiative still likely to go forward, or do I need to go on to my next best idea? And then finally, sometimes we just don't achieve the anticipated results. Again, I would use that 5 whys process to determine why you didn't achieve the results you expected, and reassess if your initiative is still viable, and if so, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and get back in the game. If not, if it just doesn't make sense anymore, then I'd go ahead and move on to your next best idea and initiative. Okay, so I've identified 12 strategies that you can use, implementation strategies for leading from the middle. I just listed a few of them here. I don't want to take too much time. I want to be very conscious of your time here. But first one that we can all do is demonstrate a bias for action. Be proactive, take initiative, move forward. Another one that we can all do is not just become an expert in your area where your initiative is, but become the expert on your particular solution, on your way to resolve the issue or to take advantage of the opportunity. And oftentimes, I remember once as a young lieutenant, I was asked to do a 2.5-minute brief for the Commandant. And it didn't occur to me until afterwards that I knew more than all the admirals and the captains in the room, including the Commandant, about solar power for aids to navigation. I didn't realize at the time. I was pretty nervous, but I became the expert on that. As a result, I could answer all the questions. And you want to be able to answer all the pros and all the cons. Be aware of those as well. If you can find a senior champion, that can do a lot to cut through red tape and reduce resistance. Networking, team, and partnering for success. This is really important. I'm going to share at least one story here. I had a chance to participate with a gentleman I'll call Dave, who was in a joint DHS-DOD exercise. And he told me a story about when he was in Afghanistan. He's a military advisor to US and Afghan military leaders in Afghanistan. And there were non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that were transporting medical supplies. So this is like Red Cross and Red Crescent, medical supplies to remote villages in the mountains of Afghanistan, for the elderly, for the children, for the sick, and so forth. But they had to go through this mountain pass, and they kept getting ambushed in this mountain pass by the Taliban. And the US military solution was, we're just going to move the road. Unfortunately, where they're going to move the road was right through the village. And in fact, they're going to have to pave over the cemetery. Now, the cemetery in this ancient village was not like the US, where graves that are 200 years old and old. They had elders there that had been buried 700 years, 1,000 years. And Dave just knew that this was a bad decision, because the Taliban could leverage that and come back and say, the Americans, they don't understand our culture, they don't understand our religion, they don't understand our tribal heritage. So Dave took an interpreter, and he asked the military leader first, can you give me just 2 days? I don't know what I'm going to do, but I think we need to find a better solution. So they said, sure, you've got 2 days. He went with an interpreter to the village, and he spoke with the village elders, which they considered very respectful, because Americans didn't usually do that. We sometimes tend to think that we have all the answers. And Dave explained the situation to them, showed where the ambushes were taking place, explained that it's very important to get the medical supplies to the other villages, because it will save lives, and it will save family members and so forth. And they said, well, thank you for spending your time with us. Please come back in 2 days and we'll have an answer. And Dave was asking for their wisdom in finding a solution. And he admitted he didn't know what the right answer was. He comes back in 2 days later and sees the most amazing thing. He sees young boys and old men with shovels and pickaxes, and they're digging up the bodies of the people buried in their graveyard, in their cemetery, and moving them to a safe location, to a new location, so that the military can then come in and pave the road, and the trucks can get through with the medical supplies safely to the villages. And I call that radical inclusion. You never know who is going to have the best solution. So include everybody, people close to the process, stakeholders, and so forth. Another strategy is to prototype or pilot each initiative. If you can do that and document, learn from, it won't be perfect the first time you do it, learn from it, make it better. Again, it's often an iterative process. And also during that same time, build support. Another thing you want to be able to do is anticipate failure, but also prepare for wild success. And I've been burned about 3 times by this wild success thing. One example was we had our 3rd Innovation Expo we held in Inner Harbor in Baltimore. At the first Innovation Expo, we had 200 people attend at the Coast Guard Academy. The second one, we had 500 people attend in Inner Harbor. And we said, well, that worked well. Let's do it again. This time we had 900 people attend, and we had over 100 exhibits at this point. And it turned out that we had so many people that the fire marshal almost shut us down because we exceeded the capacity of the hotel for both exhibits and for attendees. And then finally, there's what I call assertive strategies. I won't spend much time here, but there's things you can use unless otherwise directed. I tend to do X, flying under the radar, keeping your initiative kind of low key until you've got evidence that it will work, it will prove itself. And a few other contexts. One, the most aggressive is proceed until apprehended. I don't recommend that one unless lives are at stake. It's pretty serious. Okay. So daring to lead, I just want to summarize what we've discussed this afternoon or this morning. You can lead from wherever you are and be successful. Look for the opportunities to collaborate, form mutually beneficial partnerships, such as what we experienced with in Afghanistan. View challenges from many perspectives, including the challenger's perspective. Who might be feeling left out? What can we do to mitigate that and bring them on board? Identify and seize opportunities. What are the possibilities out there? You want to learn and apply effective strategies. We just talked about several of those for leading from wherever you are. Be a lifelong learner. Continually do research, talk to people, network, and become what I call a pro-spiritor. And by that, what I mean is leading from the middle means being proactive, not waiting to be told what to do. We talked about that. And especially not waiting to be told what to do by our managers or supervisors who are often overworked and very busy. That's not that they don't care, but they may just not have time to get back to us right away. If your idea helps your organization's mission, run it by a few knowledgeable coworkers or colleagues, see that it makes sense, and take initiative or influence decision makers to act on it. And rather than being a conspirator who might be working behind the scenes and might negatively impact trust in the organization, I encourage you and challenge you to be a can-do pro-spiritor, recognizes a person who gets things done. And you really need for you, and the nation needs for you to be successful. So bottom line, any of us can lead from the middle, and you can learn to lead from wherever you are. Unlock your potential and improve your piece of the world. And if you're a supervisor, I encourage you to try to do this with your people as well. Unlock their potential and help them improve things for your team and for your organization. Learn to be more effective, make meaningful impacts. We need for everybody to contribute, especially during a pandemic. We've seen that. And I'll just share one last real quick story. Oftentimes, we're in situations where we don't know where to go. Over a year ago, we had the government shut down, and the Coast Guard was not getting paid, but they had to go to work. They were not furloughed, but they were coming up on missing their first paycheck. And there's an organization called Coast Guard Mutual Assistance. It's headed up by a retired admiral. It's a nonprofit organization and 6 staff. And they help out Coast Guard families in financial need. The problem was they had about $1 million in liquid assets, and every 2 weeks, the salary of the 48,000 members of the Coast Guard employees was 150 million. And they had no idea how they're going to help these people out. They just didn't have enough resources. The next day, they asked for volunteers. They had about a dozen part-time volunteers, my family among them. And the next day, USAA stepped up and made a $15 million donation, which is huge. But now we had money, but we had no way to process thousands of applications and prioritize them. So the Admiral called a meeting of her staff and was looking for ideas. And one of the staff members kind of raised their hand and said, you know, Admiral, we work with the Red Cross and hurricanes. I wonder if they might be able to help us out somehow. And Admiral Thomas reached out to the Red Cross leadership, and they came through in spades. They set up 5 call centers, 3 in the US, 2 overseas, 128 staff they had working on this, and process paperwork. And the outcome of that is within, and the outcome of this was that in a 2.5-week period from the time that the first paycheck was missed until the government shutdown was stopped, this small group, the Admiral, 6 full-time staff, about a dozen volunteers, partnering with the Red Cross, partnering with USAA, was able to provide $8.3 million in no-interest loans to 6,800 Coast Guard members and their families. And my son was among them. He actually had 2 ideas that he was able to implement the first day. So even if you're new to an organization, you can still lead from the middle. You can influence others to take positive action. Oops, excuse me, sorry. Okay, so here's my contact information. I'm an employee of the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is just my thoughts, my comments. It does not reflect that of my agency. And at this point, I think we'll go ahead and turn it over for questions. Thank you.